Fairy are dangerous. I'm always telling you, beware of fairies. Never underestimate their ability to charm you, to trick or even harm you. And remember, most fairy have no regard for humans' sensitivities at all. Having said that, there are, on occasion, particular fairies who take a personal interest in us. Some even show compassion or provide practical support. Well, I have 5 true encounters with fairies which show a level of kindness rarely seen. So sit back and enjoy. Let's begin in Scotland with one of the loveliest encounters you will ever see. A poor man from Jedburgh was on his way to Horwick for the purpose of attending a market. As he was passing over the side of Rubislaw, he was suddenly alarmed by a frightful and unaccountable noise. The sound, as he supposed, proceeded from an immense number of female voices. Amidst howling and wailing were mixed shouts of mirth and jollity, but he could gather nothing articulate except the following words: "Oh, there's a bairn born, but there's nothing to put on it." The occasion of this elfish concert, it seemed, was the birth of a fairy child, at which the fairies, with the exception of 2 or 3 who were discomposed at having nothing to cover the little innocent with, were enjoying themselves with that joviality usually characteristic of such an event. The astonished rustic, finding himself amongst a host of invisible beings in a wild moorland place, and far from any human assistance, should assistance be required, full of the greatest consternation, immediately on hearing this expression again and again, "There's a bairn born, but nothing to put on it," stripped off his plaid and threw it on the ground. It was instantly snatched up by an invisible hand, and the wailings immediately ceased. But the shouts of mirth were continued with increased vigour. Being of opinion that what he had done had satisfied his invisible friends, he lost no time in making off, and proceeded on his road to Horwick, musing on his singular adventure. There he purchased a sheep, which turned out a remarkably good bargain, and returned to Jedburgh. He had no cause to regret his generosity in bestowing his plaid on the fairies, for every day afterwards his wealth multiplied, and he continued till the day of his death a rich and prosperous man. A neighbour of my grandfather was married twice and had 3 children from the first marriage, and when married for the second time he had a son and a daughter. His second wife was far from kind to the children of the first wife, neglecting their food and clothing and keeping them constantly at hard work in the fields and at herding. Well, one morning, when the man and his second wife were returning home from Mass, they passed the pasture where their cows were grazing and heard the enjoyable skirls of the bagpipes. The father said, "What may this be?" and, going off the road, found the eldest son of his first wife playing the bagpipes to his heart's pleasure, and asked him earnestly, "How did you come to play the bagpipes so suddenly? Where did you get this splendid pair of bagpipes?" The boy replied, "An old man came to me while I was roasting pots in a pit fire and said, 'Your stepmother is bad to you and has ill will towards you.' I told the man I was sensible that I knew it was the case, and then he said to me, 'If I give you a trade, Will you be inclined to follow it?" I said yes, and the old man then continued, "How would you like to be a piper by trade?" "I would gladly become a piper," says I, "but what am I to do without the bagpipes and the tunes to play?" "I'll supply the bagpipes," he said, "and as long as you have them, you'll never want for the most delightful tunes." So it was. The male descendants of that boy in question were all famous pipers thereafter. About the beginning of harvest, there having been a want of meal for shearers' bread in the farmhouse of Bedrule, a small quantity of barley, being all that was yet ripe, was cut down and converted into meal. Mrs. Buckham, the farmer's wife, rose early in the morning to bake the bread, and while she was engaged in baking, a little woman in green costume came in and, with much politeness, asked for a loan of a capful of meal. Mrs. Buckham thought it prudent to comply with her request. In a short time afterwards, the woman in green returned with an equal quantity of meal, which Mrs. Buckham put into the meal ark. This meal had such a lasting quality that from it alone the good wife of Bedrule baked as much bread as served her own family and the reapers throughout the harvest. And when harvest was over, it was still not yet exhausted. An old woman came to the wife of Stephen Callaghan, and she said, "Do not let your Stephen cut the hedge, for it's whereby we shelter at night." Mrs. Callaghan recognised the old woman as one who had been taken by the fairies while in confinement, but now older. A few nights later, the same old woman appeared to Mrs. Callaghan and asked for charity, and she was offered some meal, which she didn't take. Then she asked for lodgings, but did not stop, and went again into the night. The next morning, when Mrs. Callaghan saw the meal chest, it was overflowing with meal, for this was the old woman's gift for protecting the hedge, and for her kindness. One night there came a strange rapping at the door of the ancient manor on the Gorscock farm over in Cardiganshire, and the father of the family asked through the door what was wanted. Thin, silvery voices said they wanted a warm place in which to dress their children and to tidy them up. The man opened the door, and in came a dozen or more little beings, who at once set themselves to hunting for a base and then some water, and to cleaning themselves. At daybreak they departed, leaving a pretty gift in return for the kindness. These tales tell us a lot about the fairy folk. At the risk of sounding ungracious, it's worth us remembering, though, that before showing an act of kindness, fairy often test us. They test our character for values they expect of us: generosity, selflessness, respectfulness, compassion, and a willingness to share without question. I hope I've given you something interesting to think about. And if you'd like to support my channel, there are 3 easy ways. All the links are in the notes below. I'd really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!